All right, we are continuing with our sermon series called On This Rock, and it's a character series about the Apostle Peter. And we're just taking a look at how following Jesus changed his life. We will finish up on Pentecost Sunday in Acts chapter 2 and see how Pentecost transforms Peter. The last Sunday we were in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, with a very familiar passage called with Peter walks on water. And this has been a long week. I know there's only 7 days in a week, but this week felt like it had about 12 or 13 days in it. So I'm going to read this passage and then just share a few words with you from last Sunday. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake, while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up onto a mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." They were so frightened they screamed. Just then, Jesus spoke to them, "Be encouraged. It is me. Do not be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water towards Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. And as he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" And when they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son." Now, last Sunday, during our Zoom gathering, we got hacked and it was kind of crazy. And we talked about this idea that as Peter was walking on the water, he was very much distracted by the waves. And let me just tell you that I have preached through a lot of things, including crying children, people snoring, fans being knocked over and crashing to the ground, people dropping and breaking things. Never have I preached through someone hacking my sermon, and it was very difficult to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus and not on the other distractions of the hacker. It was not humorous. It's still not quite humorous. I'm sure in 3 months it might be humorous, but it was definitely a living illustration of how hard it is to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus in the midst of a storm. We looked at this idea that the 12 were in this boat. So the apostles, even though Jesus had many disciples, he had 12 that he set aside for some specific ministry purposes. And so the 12 of them were in this boat and they were heading towards the other side. It was nighttime, it was dark, they were alone, and there was a storm. And sometimes we read the story and we forget that there are 4 fishermen in the boat. So they're not surprised by this. They're used to being on the lake at night, alone, in the dark, and they have experienced plenty of storms along the way in their fishing careers. So this isn't anything new to them. However, what was different, what was completely out of the ordinary, was seeing someone walking on the water. And I don't care how much we believe in Jesus, I know about Jesus, anybody walking on water is going to freak us out. It's something they've never experienced before. And they were so afraid, it says that they screamed. That's pretty scary. I don't know, maybe like me, right? When I get frightened, I tend to hold my breath. screaming isn't the first thing that I do, but they were so afraid that they shouted out loud in their fear. And Jesus replies, he immediately encourages them and comforts them, saying, "Don't be afraid." And Peter responds, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come on the water, or to come to you on the water." And I think that when we're in situations that are completely unfamiliar, kind of like a pandemic, sometimes we have to, as they would say, test the spirits. We have to say, "Jesus, is this you? Is this something else?" When we're trying to make decisions about things, we really need to seek his face, ask him to show himself to us, and to tell us, is this you? And in the story we had listened to a few weeks ago in Matthew chapter 5, where Peter has this miraculous catch of fish, Jesus says to Peter, even though they had been fishing all night, throw your nets out, push out into further deep water, cast your nets, and let your nets down. And Peter was exhausted from fishing all night, but he said, "Because you tell me, I will do it." And so I think this is kind of like the next step, right? Peter says, this isn't just about because you say so. He's saying, show me who you are. Prove to me that this is you. Let me know that this is really you, and I'll come to you. And so Peter gets out of the boat, which kudos to Peter for getting out of the boat, because when we're afraid, the last thing we want to do is take any more risks. We do not want to take risks when we are afraid. And Peter gets out of the boat. One of my favorite books, John Ortenberg wrote the book, "If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat," which I think is just a classic line, because that is true. We're not going to experience great miracles without getting out of the boat. The South African preacher Angus Buchan says, "The condition for a great miracle is impossibility." But Peter must have thought to himself, you know what? If this is my rabbi and I'm his disciple, he's not going to tell me to do anything that I can't do. That he's setting this example for me. And so, for whatever reason, he thought, well, if Jesus is walking on this water and I'm supposed to be like my rabbi, then I should be able to walk on water too. When he sees the strong winds, though, he becomes frightened and he begins to sink. And Peter has learned this much. When I begin to doubt, when I am afraid, call on the name of the Lord. And Peter set an example for all of us when he said, "Lord, rescue me." When we find ourselves in seasons we're frightened, when we are beginning to doubt, when we are questioning things, including our faith, one of the best things that we can do is just cry out to the name of the Lord and ask him to rescue us. And Jesus immediately, the first thing that Jesus does is he reaches out and he grabs him. And he doesn't say, "Hey, Peter, figure it out yourself." Instead, he reaches out and he grabs him up. And then he gets into the boat. And when we are frightened and when we are doubting and when we are struggling, Jesus is willing to get in the boat with us. And so he gets back in the boat and he does say, he says, "Why did you begin to doubt?" I don't think Peter was doubting Jesus. I think Peter was doubting that God would give him the power to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. That we are called to be Christ-like. And sometimes when we struggle, and sometimes when we fail, when we fall down, when we find ourselves returning to ways that are not Christ-like, we can begin thinking that this life of holiness is completely impossible. And Jesus says, "Why do you doubt?" And so, as we move through the rest of this week, I want to leave you with this idea that when we are doubting and when we are struggling, to keep our eyes on Jesus. All we have to do is cry out, Lord, rescue me, and He will get in the boat with us. I leave you with this benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you and make His face to shine upon you. And in your doubts, may you still cry out to the name of the Lord. We will see you next week.